Hopefully by now you've reviewed the big five personality types, not only the video lecture, but also the readings in the chapter. And you have a pretty good understanding of what those big five personality types are all about and which ones are better at different situations than others. But it's important to look beyond just the big five personality types because it's important to zero in more specifically on what makes individuals different from one another, things that go beyond personality. So, in order to take this leap beyond personality, we have to look at four things that form part of core self evaluations, or CSEs. And these four items, these four CSEs, help us more precisely describe ourselves, right? So if we're talking personality, we have those five categories. Maybe we're extroverted, maybe we're conscientious, maybe we're emotionally stable. But beyond those personality types, these four CSEs help us zero in a lot more specifically. Now, the good news is that the research shows that if we score highly on each of these four CSEs, then we're more likely to perform well at our jobs. We're more likely to be satisfied with our careers and our lives more generally. We're more likely to be motivated individuals, and we're more likely to have organizational citizenship behavior. And you'll remember from the last chapter that organizational citizenship means we go above and beyond what our job description tells us we must do, and we volunteer our time, we do extra work, and we're motivated to help the organization. So if you or any of your employees in the future are not performing well, I would ask you to take a look at these four pieces of the CSE puzzle, as we call it, and see how they're rating on each of these four performance indicators. So let's describe what these four indicators actually are, understand why they're important, and then let's talk about how we can apply them in the real world. So the first of these CSEs is called self-efficacy, or generalized self-efficacy. And this is how it works. If you have high self-efficacy, that means you believe that you have a pretty good chance of successfully completing a task. Right? If you have a high sense of self-efficacy in this course, that means you feel pretty good that you can get an excellent grade in this course. If your boss asks you to do something new at your job, and if you have high self-efficacy, then you have a pretty good feeling that you can succeed at what your boss is asking you to do. Now, how can someone have a higher sense of self-efficacy? Are we just born with it, or can we actually learn and teach ourselves to have an increased sense of self-efficacy? Well, the good news is we can improve at it. And one of the biggest ways that we can improve at self-efficacy is based on our prior experience. So if I'm asking you to do something for the first time, something you've never done before, you're probably not going to have a great sense of self-efficacy because you haven't really done it before. But experience is one way of improving our self-efficacy. If none of you had ever, maybe some of you haven't, but if none of you had ever given a public presentation to a class or to a large audience, or to a big business meeting, and I ask you to do a 15-minute presentation in front of everyone in person, then if you've never done it before, you're probably going to have a lower sense of self-efficacy than if you had done this 5 or 6 times already. So one way of improving our self-efficacy is simply by practice. Another way of improving our self-efficacy, in other words, feeling more confident in our ability to do something, is receiving positive feedback or even negative feedback accompanied by recommendations as to how we can improve, right? So if you want to increase your self-efficacy, practice certainly helps, but also having a manager or a mentor who's willing to give you honest and very constructive feedback can help increase your self-efficacy. In my own experience, I had the benefit of being asked to run a business for my company when I was very young, and I was sent to Japan to live for a period of time to help manage the business in Japan. And my sense of self-efficacy should have been very low because I had never left the United States before. It was the first time, and I had never done business in Japan. So logically, my sense of self-efficacy should have been pretty low because I hadn't done it before. But years later, when I was asked to go to Japan a second time with a different company, my sense of self-efficacy probably should have been higher because during my first experience, I got a lot of practice. I received feedback from my managers in terms of what I was doing badly and what I was doing well. And I basically had that experience that gave me a stronger sense of self-efficacy. And again, why is self-efficacy good? Well, it's good because the more my self-efficacy is, the more motivated I will be, the more productive I will be, and the more likely I will be to be a good organizational citizen. So that's self-efficacy. Now, there's a second component to core self-evaluations, and that's called self-esteem. And self-esteem is a general belief about your own self-worth. If you have a high sense of self-esteem, then you think you're worthwhile, you think you're valuable, you think you're worth it. How do we increase our self-esteem? Well, by achieving things, right? The more we achieve, the more we succeed, the higher our sense of self-esteem actually is. You might be able to relate to this, but when I was a student, I never thought I was going to do well in certain economics courses because it was the first time I was taking them, and I just always viewed them as extremely hard. And so when I took a couple of courses in economics and I wound up enjoying it and doing very well, in other words, I had some achievements, I started to have higher self-esteem because I saw that I can actually achieve a good grade in economics classes. The other thing that tends to increase our self-esteem is when people give you praise for a job well done. I don't mean the kind of praise that gives you a big ego, but I mean the kind of praise that demonstrates that you've done a good job and motivates you to do even better in the future. Okay, so self-esteem is important. The ways of improving self-esteem are actually achieving something and getting the positive feedback that reinforces those positive achievements. What does it mean if you have low self-esteem? If you have low self-esteem, then you basically think of yourself in negative terms. You don't feel good about yourself, and you're very doubtful about your capabilities. Now, this could be a normal step in the development process. The way to combat negative self-esteem is to work with managers, work with mentors, work with people who care about your achievement, people who will give you the necessary feedback so that you can improve. And then as you improve, you'll develop a series of accomplishments that will increase your self-esteem. So that's the nature of self-esteem. The third component of CSEs is probably one of my favorite, and we call it a locus of control. A locus of control describes how much responsibility we take at the personal level for our behavior and its consequences. If I have an external locus of control, then that means I tend to point fingers at other people as opposed to myself, right? Think about it. If you take a test, if you take an exam in college and you fail the exam, someone with an external locus of control might say, well, my professor doesn't like me. My professor is unfair. My professor hates me, right? That's an external locus of control. Someone with an internal locus of control, on the other hand, will point the finger at themselves and they'll say, I failed the exam because I really didn't know the material that well, or I didn't prepare sufficiently for the exam. Okay, so an external locus of control points the finger externally towards other people. An internal locus of control points the finger at ourselves and says, what could I have done better? What did I do wrong? What do I need to improve at? People who have an internal locus of control tend to be more motivated, understandably, because they say, I can do something positive to change next time, rather than pointing the finger at everybody else. People who have an internal locus of control also have they also believe that their effort leads to better performance. They say, look, maybe I failed this exam, but I know exactly what I need to do to get an A the next time. So they tend to be more motivated and more proactive. And people who have an internal locus of control also tend to be more satisfied with their job, right? Especially if they see that they can be rewarded for their performance. On the other hand, if you have an external locus of control, then you're less motivated to do a good job, partially because you don't think you can make any changes that can help you do a better job. You're totally dependent on other people. And people with external locus of control, they tend to earn lower salaries than people with an internal locus of control as well. And they also tend to be more anxious in the workplace. So it's important to train ourselves to try to have a more internal locus of control as we go through life. It makes for better outcomes, it makes for more stability, and it certainly makes for more progress in our jobs. And then the last trait that I'll talk about here is what we call emotional stability. And people who have a high level of emotional stability tend to be more relaxed, they tend to be more secure, they tend to be less worried, and they tend not to experience negative emotions under pressure. On the other hand, if you have a low level of emotional stability, then you tend to get anxious a lot, and you tend to view the world around you very negatively. And why is knowing this about your employees or even about yourself something valuable in organizational development? Well, employees that have high levels of emotional stability tend to perform better. They tend to also have higher organizational citizenship behaviors, right? Volunteering more, going above and beyond more, doing things to help the organization outside of their job description. And people that have high levels of emotional stability also tend to show fewer counterproductive work behaviors. They tend to cause less problems at work. They tend to be more interactive with people around them. Okay, so emotional stability is one of those traits that is worth cultivating and certainly worth developing. Let's do a little bit of practice. So take this situation. Joe was terminated from his job. He was fired. And he believes that the reason for him being fired is that his boss didn't like him and that his hard work was not appreciated. Right? So I get fired, and my immediate reaction is to say, well, my boss didn't like me. I likely have what? Do I have high emotional stability? Do I have an internal locus of control? Do I have low self-efficacy? Do I have an external locus of control? Or do I have low self-esteem? In this situation, the best answer is D. I probably have an external locus of control. Why? Well, if my immediate reaction to getting fired is that I'm blaming my boss instead of myself, then I'm probably pointing the finger externally as opposed to at myself. What would it look like if I had an internal locus of control instead? Well, if I had an internal locus of control, I might react to the firing very differently. I might say, what did I do wrong? Or I might say, my boss has told me several times to change my behavior and I haven't. So this is probably the reason I got fired, pointing the finger at myself rather than at my boss. So as you go through the quiz for this module, and as you go through the readings in the textbook, make sure you're able to distinguish the different characteristics of the 4 core self-evaluations, because you will be tested in the quiz on applying these concepts of core self-evaluations to specific situations. And certainly when it comes time for the final exam, you'll be expected to demonstrate that you know how to apply these CSEs and these personality traits to some real-world situations.